All right, well, thanks very much, Tiff, and welcome everybody. Just so we can get a sense, those that are here for the first time, this is your first Market for Intelligence conference. Show your hands. Wow, okay. Well, welcome. I know many of you have traveled from outside the country. Welcome to Canada. And for those of you who have been here before, welcome back. We're glad to have you. Those who've been here before know that every year we have a theme at this conference. A couple of years ago, the theme was time. And so the idea was that at that time in 2017, we had seen a couple of years of significant acceleration of the use of machine intelligence for an increasingly wide range of problems. Many problems we thought of had gone from ideas to proof of concept. And so at that point in 2017, the question, the narrative had changed from if to when, rather than might AI be useful for this, to when will a commercial grade AI arrive for a particular application. Last year, the theme was complements. So the idea was a complement in AI is everything other than the statistical model required to bring the AI to market. This year, our theme is power. The theme this year is power. That we can think of a taxonomy of AIs, broadly speaking, where some are what we might think of as efficiency AIs. Those are AIs, we build them, and they effectively replace where we were already doing some kind of predictive analytics, and we just take out some older statistical techniques and replace them with these newer techniques. And we get a productivity bump. But then on the other branch of the taxonomy are what we might think of as strategic AIs. They do more than enhance efficiency. They shift power. So to set the stage for today, I'd like to offer a framework for how you might think about power. And so to do this, it's useful just to have in your head a few simple concepts from economics. The first one is feedback loops. So the idea here is that probably the primary distinguishing feature of machine intelligence systems relative to normal or other software systems is that these systems learn, and the way they learn is through feedback. Now, sometimes those feedback loops occur in isolation, but other times those feedback loops interact with market forces. And that's when we have sort of the first step towards a potential power shift, and we get phenomena like this, where we have better predictions attract more users generate more data lead to better predictions. And when the flywheel starts to turn, what can happen is we can have multiple AIs competing, they're all doing sort of roughly the same prediction, and then one AI gets just enough better than the others that people using the other AI say, why would we want to use a second best prediction? And so some migrate over to the better AI. Now that AI has more users, more data, it improves further. Now it's even better. Others say, well, why are we using a second best AI? And eventually, there's a fair amount of migration and so what starts off as a small gap turns into a much greater gap. That is largely enabled by the fact that in the traditional economy, it's usually the case that things that are higher quality cost more. Higher quality things cost more. Not true with predictions. A higher quality, the marginal cost of a higher quality prediction, so the cost of producing one more prediction is no higher for a high quality prediction than it is for a mediocre prediction. The marginal quality of high quality predictions is the same as it is for medium quality predictions. Here's the third point. In the old economy, or the traditional economy, we thought a lot about minimum efficient scale. So think about factories. Factories understood that as they got bigger, as they expanded their capacity, the average unit cost fell. So bigger factory, lower unit cost, up to a certain point. And after we hit that certain point, then even if we make the factory bigger, we don't benefit from lower unit costs. That point is what we refer to as minimum efficient scale. Now, the reason that's important is because it's hard for companies to compete if they're not big enough, because they haven't compete with those that have reached minimum scale if they haven't, because their costs are higher. Now, the same concept applies in machine intelligence. But rather than the size of the factory, what we're worried about is the amount of data and the prediction accuracy. Minimum efficient scale can come from a variety of factors in AI. One is regulatory. Regulatory can set that threshold, that a prediction has to be a sufficient level of accuracy, let's say for a medical diagnostic AI, in order to be introduced into the market. It can come from usability, that the prediction accuracy has to hit some threshold to be good enough to warrant the cost to the user. So for example, for those of you that use a smart email client that gives you the suggestions at the bottom of your email, the cost is the use of that real estate on your screen, and so the prediction has to be good enough that there's enough times that the suggestion is useful that you're willing to use up that real estate. A third is competition. That competition might set the minimum efficient scale bar. That if there are already competitors producing a prediction, that sets the limit. You have to be at least as good as them to enter the market, or nobody will use your prediction. Okay, so what that does, what the minimum efficient scale does in AI is it sets a bar. And in order to compete in that market, companies have to keep improving their prediction accuracy until they hit minimum efficient scale. If the minimum efficient scale is low, many companies can enter. We have a competitive market, no power issues. If minimum efficient scale is higher, it's harder to get up to hit the scale, and therefore a fewer number can make it over the line, and that can lead to concentration of power. Here's the fourth point. That minimum efficient scale can move. That once companies get over the line, they can make investments to start moving the threshold up to make it harder for the others to get over the line. So there's an economist at London School of Economics named John Sutton who's written a whole book on this point. It's precisely the reason why there used to be dozens of commercial airplane manufacturers, dozens of them. But today, it would cost tens or hundreds of billions for a new company to enter and compete with Boeing or Airbus, because they have moved the threshold up so high. Same with pharmaceuticals, same with semiconductors, and so on. A lot of concentration of power when we move up the line. That enables those who get over the threshold to sustain their power, to move the line up through endogenous sunk costs. Okay, let me walk you through a thought experiment. Think of this as a prediction that everybody's familiar with. This is using AI for medical diagnosis. So anytime you or I get sick, we go and see the doc. The doc looks at us. We have a bunch of symptoms, and the doc makes a prediction of what the underlying causes are, a diagnosis. Diagnosis is prediction. Now, the problem with human docs is they make a lot of mistakes. Over 12 million serious medical misdiagnoses a year. Furthermore, those mistakes are expensive. Almost a third of medical malpractice suits are due to failed diagnoses. Now, here's an interesting thing, is that I know some of you are following this literature very closely, others not so much, that in the medical literature, in the last 2 years, there have been a swell of what I would refer to as Horserace papers. So these are papers published in medical journals, some of them in the top journals, JAMA, New England Journal of Medicine, Lancet. And the reason we call them Horserace papers is because they are racing or comparing AIs to medical experts. And the reason they're getting published in these peer-reviewed journals is because the results are surprising. That time and time again, the AIs are matching or beating the performance of medical experts. AI is better able to classify problems in pathology slides. AI is better able to classify problems in medical images. AI is better able to predict attempted suicide than mental health experts. Now, all of this stuff right now is happening in scientific journals. It's still at the science level. Almost none of these yet have been deployed at scale, commercial grade, in a clinical setting. But right now, there are sets of people who are looking at what's happening in the science and projecting out. They are projecting, where is this going? Here's an example of one person projecting. They were on this stage in June of this year at Creative Destruction Lab, our super session. This is Vinod Khosla, who's a prolific investor in AI based in the Bay. So he says, any radiologist who plans to practice in 10 years will be killing patients every day. It will only be their arrogance that lets them practice because it would be criminal. They would be misdiagnosing much more than normal systems. Now, there's 2 points in here. The first one is whether the AI will replace the radiologist. I know that this room will erupt into debate if we get into that. So we'll put that aside. My point is not relying on whether the AI replaces the radiologist or augments the radiologist. That's a separate issue. But here's the important issue that might have just whisked by your eyes and you didn't even really give it a second thought. It's the number 10. Because people like Vinod, he is deploying hundreds of millions of dollars with a thesis of how long it will take to get there. And it really matters whether your thesis is 5 or 10 or 20 or 50. Okay, so how do we think about how this plunge in the cost of prediction, so we think of Avi Goldfarb, Joshua Gans, and I, and now many others think of the rise of AI as a drop in the cost of prediction. So how does a drop in the cost of prediction impact power? To help us think this through, we've developed this framework we call the power wheel. Okay, so in this, we think about 3 dimensions. One is the impact on occupations, jobs. The other is the impact on markets. And the third is the impact on geopolitical power, nations. Okay, at the center of this wheel is the key prediction. In this case, diagnosis. So the question here is, what happens when there is a shock, a plunge in the cost of prediction that's applied to diagnosis? In the first inner ring is those that lose power as a result of the power moving from predictions we make in our heads to predictions made by the AIs. So in this case, it could be doctors and doctors' offices. Then the next ring is who potentially gains power. Who's the substitute for the human prediction? In this case, it's like the software companies, for example, that build the AIs, that own the prediction. The next layer out are which are the markets that are the complements to AIs. In other words, you need those additional things to bring the AIs to market. In this case, you can think of markets, for example, such as medical imaging equipment. You can't make the prediction without the input, and the input in this case, one input would be medical images. Now, why these matter is because underlying this wheel is about 50 years of research in a subfield of economics called I/O, industrial organization. What I'm doing here is a wicked simplification of some very nuanced work. But the key point here is how competitive are these markets? So in other words, if the market for producing these diagnostic AIs is competitive, then the power that's lost from the doctors flows right through that ring because they compete the power away. And then it potentially gets picked up in the next ring, the complements. But if the market for complements is competitive, then they compete all that power away, and it flows right through potentially to the last layer, what we call residual claimants. Residual claimants are all of the others in that ecosystem that don't either own the AI or own the complements to AI. So for example, in this case, you might think of the patients. If the AI companies don't get to, if they're competitive, they don't capture the power, and the complements are competitive, let's say the medical imaging companies, let's imagine that's a competitive market, so they compete away the power, then who benefits? The residual claimants, the patients. The patients benefit with lower cost diagnostics. The insurance companies benefit with lower payments, lower cost treatment. Now, here's the thing to imagine. Right now, in this market, power is very fragmented. Power is dotted right across the country. There are tiny centers of power. Each one is a doctor's office. And they are scattered from coast to coast. When you and I get sick, we go in, we see a doc, and the doc looks at us, examines us, and then sends us out to a specialist or a clinic or whatever. Each one of those doctor's offices is a tiny center of power. Now think of this shock, the shock at the center of the power wheel. It comes in, a prediction diagnostic, it ripples out, and the doctors now the predictions are being done by AIs rather than doctors. The doctors lose that power. They may still have their jobs, but they are no longer doing the diagnosis. And imagine if the next ring, the AI company, is concentrated. So right now, for example, lung cancer, there are 5 or 6, half a dozen projects of everybody building AIs that are predicting lung cancer. Now what happens? One of those AIs gets a little better than the rest. And all of a sudden, they get good enough, just that much better, that people using it, why are we using the second best diagnostic tool? So they start migrating over to the first, and more migrate, and then it gets better, and more migrate, until we have largely a winner in lung detection, lung cancer prediction. And same in breast cancer, and same in prostate cancer, and Alzheimer's, and so on. And then what we already see are investors in private equity and so on who are making bets across different fields with an ultimate objective to consolidate. So who knows? At the very extreme, if we push the argument to its extreme, we have one AI diagnostic company. One AI diagnostic company. So all of that power that used to be distributed across all of those doctors' offices whoosh, is now concentrated in a single 1 or 2 or 3 diagnostic companies. Now, some of you are sitting there thinking, this is Crazytown. I can't even imagine what it could look like if all the power that used to be distributed across all these doctors' offices is now concentrated in 1 or 2 or 3 AI diagnostic companies. I can't even imagine what that would look like. Actually, yes, you can. Yes, you can, because you've all lived through it. You've seen it right under your nose, just in a different market, in the market for curated information. There used to be tiny little centers of power for curating information dotted across the country from coast to coast. We called them libraries. Every town had one. And some of them were designed in a way to reflect their power. This is the Library of Congress in Washington. This one is the Bodleian Library at Oxford. This is the Vatican Library. Now, for most of us, we didn't get to use the Vatican Library. We used something that looked more like this. But either way, each one was a much smaller, a distributed center of power. That when we needed information, we made our way to the library. There was an expert there, someone trained in library science, a librarian, and they would navigate our journey to find our information. I suspect that in this room, probably nobody, 20 years ago, nobody anticipated that 2 people like these working in their garage would 20 years later produce something that would concentrate power in a single company in Mountain View, California, or maybe a second in Redmond. That power in that market would be concentrated. And I suspect 20 years ago that very few people in this room would have guessed that here we are today and that we would be debating in the U.S., for example, the U.S. Election campaigns about antitrust issues of breaking up the companies that have consolidated the power that used to be held by libraries. I suspect that 20 years ago, very few people in this room would have predicted that we would be having international debates and discussions around national security because of the power has been so concentrated in the United States and China. I suspect that, forget 20 years ago, I suspect that very few people in this room 10 years ago would have anticipated that those little centers of power across the country, dotted from coast to coast, for transporting people, we called them taxi companies, that very few people would have anticipated 10 years ago that the power in those companies would today be consolidated in 2 companies in California, that predicated on AIs for navigation, for AIs that predict the supply and demand for rides in neighborhoods, would consolidate all that power that used to be distributed from coast to coast. There are, of course, many companies competing right now in autonomous vehicles. I don't know who's going to win. There are many competitors. But one thing that seems increasingly likely, as my co-authors and I spend time in Washington, is there's level 4, there's level 5, and so on. But the question is, which regulator, at the end of the day, when this finally becomes legal, we can take our hands off the wheel, which regulator is going to make the case that, yes, we should have a second and third and fourth best AI allowed to drive? The point is, the technology, at some level, consolidates power. And I think the question for today, for people to consider, as you're watching these various presentations, some presentations in healthcare, presentations in robots, presentations in different markets, is to ask yourself, which of these flywheels lend themselves to efficiency versus power? And then that raises the question, for the ones where we think there may be power, from the perspective of companies, what are the optimal strategies? And from the perspective of governments, what can we do to optimize and enhance society? Because if we're entering a regime where the technology leads to a concentration of power, by the time we get there, it will be too late. And so now's the time for us to think about how do we lay the foundation for a society that is good for everybody. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for today's session. Mark,